I was just thinking about this. We just read yesterday about Bilam, who was the prophet of the nations, where the Minchas tells us that there was no greater prophet than Moshe Rabbeinu. Lo kam navi b'Yisrael k'Moshe. Among the Jewish people, there was never a prophet as great as Moshe Rabbeinu. It's one of the tenets of Jewish belief. He was the father of all prophets, greater than those who preceded him and those who followed him. But yet, it says among the nations of the world, there was somebody who was the equivalent of Moshe Rabbeinu. Who was that? That was Bilam. Bilam was the prophet of the nations. We just read about it this past week, how he was commissioned to curse the Jewish people. Because they had said that just as Moshe's power lies in his mouth, Bilam, his power lies in his mouth. However, he didn't succeed. God did not allow him to curse the Jewish people. Now, let's understand who is Bilam. We find that when the Jews were in Egypt, initially, after the generation passed away, they had concocted a plan which was the equivalent of the final solution in terms of the spirituality of the Jewish people, that through enslavement, ultimately the Jews would assimilate and just totally disappear through serious enslavement. And they set quotas of how much each person has to produce every day in terms of production. And through that, initially they believed either they will die because of the physical work, they wouldn't survive it. And if not, they'll assimilate. The women will assimilate and there won't be any trace of Jewish people any longer. Now, who's the one who came up with this approach? So we mentioned the Gemara many times. Paro had three advisors: Yisro, Eov, and Bilam. Yisro was ultimately the father of Moshe Rabbeinu. He was the Sheikh of Midian. Eov was the Job, was the one who had suffered the sufferings of Job. And then there was Bilam, who was the prophet of the nations. So Bilam had advised Paro, enslave the Jews. That's what you must do. When Yisro heard this, he fled in protest. He says, how could you enslave a people? Their ancestor, Yosef, had saved Egypt from perishing during the great famine. And Egypt was only the power it was because of Yosef, the wealth. They'd gathered all the wealth to Egypt. It's total a miscarriage of justice and every conceivable understanding of what decency is. He fled. Job remained silent. He did not protest. Okay? But Bilam perpetrated this. And not only did he give the final solution, he was also a sorcerer. He set a certain spell around Egypt that no Jew, no slave could flee from Egypt. It was like an invisible force which did not allow anyone to flee Egypt. So the Jews would be locked into this state of impurity, and ultimately the impurity of Egypt would snuff out the spirituality of Jewish people. What was Bilam's? Where was he coming from? The Ramchal had explained that Egypt, in terms of a location which represented all the nether forces, evil, was the place to be. That's why they had the witchcraft, which was at this very advanced level, was Egypt. Because witchcraft is a derivative of the nether forces, manipulating the nether forces, undermining God's involvement in the world. And that's the counterbalance to holiness. There was incest, idolatry, every conceivable issue or behavior which was the antithesis of spirituality and a kedusha of holiness was in Egypt. And we were there. And Bilam understood that if we're there long enough, ultimately, we would actually be extinguished. There wouldn't be a trace of our spirituality left. And it nearly succeeded. Because when did God take us out of Egypt? After 210 years. Although we did not fulfill all the years, we were meant to be there 400 years. But God had to take us out then because we reached the lowest level of impurity. And if we would have gone beyond that point, we would have gone to a state of extinction. So God had to take us out then. At that moment, couldn't wait a moment longer. So what Bilam didn't understand, that although if it would have continued, he would have succeeded, God said the world has a value, it has a purpose. And the purpose is that the Jewish people have to arrive at Sinai and they have to be given a choice to accept the Torah or not. And if they go beyond that point in Egypt, they will no longer have any choice. They would actually have forfeited because of the level of impurity they would have absorbed. They wouldn't have had the ability to make a choice. So God literally plucked them out of Egypt to begin the process of rehabilitation, which is 49 days from Egypt to Sinai, and the 50th day we were given the Torah. That was all part of the rehabilitation. But Bilam, what he understood, because he didn't believe God had the ability to intervene and to override what he had put in place, if a single slave couldn't flee from Egypt, with millions of people, how are they going to leave Egypt? No way. They're locked in there forever to spiritually meet their demise. God had other plans. He overrode the witchcraft, all the sorcery, all the impurity. He plucked us out of there. What we've read in this last week's parsha, Bilam realized that his plan of extinguishing and removing any vestige of holiness in the world failed. And Bilam said, initially you had said, Balak had said, the king of Moab, Moabite king, you originally sit in place that not one person can flee from Egypt. Not only one, more than a person, a whole nation fled. And now they're at our doorstep and they may destroy us. So he put it into his face, literally. Bilam being suffered from megalomania. Could you imagine saying this to him? Bilam, you failed. You're not what you're made out to be. You have to prove yourself. Bilam was so enraged that the Jewish people actually created a global embarrassment for Bilam. He will not leave a stone unturned. He will destroy the Jewish people. This is the story with Bilam. What did Bilam? What was his objective? To extinguish the holiness of the world. God should not have a presence in the world. That was his objective. He failed, but he believed he's not going to fail this time. And he will succeed. And if not for Pinchas' intervention at the last moment, he would have succeeded. Because the Torah states in this week's reading, God says, if not for Bilam's if not for Pinchas' zealotry and expressing his wrath, my wrath would have consumed the Jewish people. So Bilam was on target, but always something comes out of left field for Bilam that somehow interferes with his plan. Whether it was God leaving Egypt, whether it's Pinchas intervening at this moment, doing his exceptional act of zealotry. That's the story. Now, there's a balance in the world. As we said many times, there's evil and there's good. The Jewish people, not only do we maintain the good, we generate the good and we advance the good. How? Through our actions. What are actions? That if we live within the context of the Torah, which are the positive, negative commandments, we secure the good. Not only do we secure it, we advance it. Now, what is evil? God does not advance evil. Evil is a reality from the beginning of creation, that whenever there's a vacuum, there's evil. The greater the vacuum, the greater the evil, the more intense the evil is. So evil is a reality which is out there, except if you fill the vacuum with oxygen, so there's no room for that vacuum any longer. So if the Jews continuously advance spiritually, and we do what we're supposed to do, we fill in existence with good, there's no room for evil, because evil is the absence of good. This is an important point which I'm making, which I thought about yesterday. So evil, when the non-Jews, when they do the evil, it's not they're creating the evil. They are what they are. The nations of the world are what they are. They represent evil. They can extricate themselves from what they are if somehow they assist Jews in their objective. They come on the Jews' coattail. But in terms of what they are, they could not generate good. God will allow existence to exist if they don't cross certain lines, which are the 7 no-hide laws. As we point out, they're all negative commandments. They don't contribute to the advancements of the world, the nations of the world. They don't contribute. The Jews are the only ones who contribute to the advancement of the world, which is called perfection, was only the Jew could generate positive energy. We generate positive energy through the mitzvahs, through the positive commandments, which we do. When we violate the negative commandment, that we undermine our spiritual standing. And when we do the positive, we advance our spirituality. So when we speak about the destruction of the temple, we speak about the Crusades, we talk about all the suffering throughout history, the Holocaust. When the nations of the world brought about whatever they brought about, that is who they are. In essence, we created the setting and we empowered them. How do we empower them? I'll give you an example. Person has a vest, impregnable vest. Nothing can pierce that armor. But if we take off that armor, then we become vulnerable to whatever that attack is. There is a representation out there which has an overwhelming level of negative force, which could consume us. But we have something which deflects that. Not only deflects it, it keeps it at bay to such a level, it almost doesn't function. It has no effect on the world because we occupy most of existence. How do we occupy it? Not through our numbers, through our deeds, which are the mitzvahs that we do, the Torah we study. We fill the whole world with kedusha, with holiness. As a result of that, there's no evil. But the moment there's a lack of holiness and there's no empowerment of good, all of a sudden, what's left? All that's left are nether forces. They're there. And not only do we even contribute to it, because when we do, we sin. We empower the nether forces. It's not the nations of the world empower themselves. We empower them. Because the less kedusha, the less holiness, the greater the vacuum. The more we sin, we contribute to the vacuum. But the nations of the world themselves are not the ones who create this evil. They are the evil, except they have choice. During the vacuum, who chooses to try to snuff out or to minimize the vestige of holy that's left? Initially, it was the Babylonians. And then it was the Greeks. Or before it was the Persians. And it was the Greeks. And ultimately it was the Romans. But they were only able to do what they did was because this impregnable armor was gradually being thinned out. And we became more vulnerable and more vulnerable because we couldn't deflect. The vacuum was growing. It grew to such a level, God says, I'm not here any longer. And that caused the destruction of the temple. So throughout history, whenever there's a problem for Jews, who's the cause of that problem? Not the nations of the world. If a person puts his hand in the fire and gets burnt, is it the fire's issue that you got burnt? You put your hand in the fire. If a person doesn't maintain his health and his health has a decline in health, do you have anybody to blame but yourself? The system has to be energized, has to be nourished, has to be sustained. If you don't sustain it automatically, it deteriorates. If we don't maintain the holiness, you ever see these bubbles over swimming pools? You have to have that air being pumped into that bubble continuously. Otherwise, what happens? It collapses. Why did it collapse? Isn't anybody to blame but the person who shut off the generator that was pumping the air into that bubble, which kept it inflated? Same thing. We generate the goodness. As a result of that, there's less vacuum. The moment we stop infusing the world with goodness, the evil that's there is there. Not only is it there, but that's the nations of the world. We contribute to the evil. We empower it. Because by us sinning, as we discussed, when we sin, it creates a negative force. That negative force adds to what they are. So we are actually the cause of our own issues. And that's what Chafetz Chaim writes in the name of the Jerusalem Talmud. And it has to do with Tisha B'Av. We mourn the destruction of the first and the second Beis Hamikdash on the 9th of Av. They were both destroyed on the same day. And the Jerusalem Talmud says that the generation in which the temple was not built, it's considered it was destroyed. Why? Because the Jewish people always have the ability to recreate the forces, to minimize that vacuum, that the temple should be restored. So why hasn't it been restored? I'll give you an example. Before you build a building, the site has to be prepared for that structure. And you have all the permits, and you have all the zoning, and you have all the material, but the site has never been prepared. Could you build a building? Everything's ready to go. This building site hasn't been prepared to put up such a structure. God is ready to come. The temple could come any moment. But because of the vacuum, it doesn't have any relevance to this existence. That's why the temple has been. Now the question is, why is the vacuum here? Why don't we somehow fill in that vacuum with enough goodness that the site is ready for the temple to come about? So who's culpable? It was destroyed more than 2,000 years ago. Boy, what hasn't been rebuilt? We could have made the difference. So therefore, the Jerusalem Talmud says that the generation which was not built, God says, I consider as if you destroyed it. You people make the difference. How do we make the difference? Again, God said, I'm ready to come right through that door immediately. You're not opening the door. You have a house filled with smoke and you invite a guest to come to the house. You have to somehow ventilate the location because otherwise the person will be asphyxiated with the smoke. So clear the smoke, clean the location, prepare the location. Then the guest comes. That's exactly what Jewish history is. We've always taken the oxygen out of the room. It has nothing to do with the Gentiles, nothing to do with the nations of the world. They are who they are because of who they are. That's why it's cited based on verses and prophets. At the end of time, the nations of the world are going to be destroyed. The only ones going to be left are the Jewish people and the members of the nations of the world who had relevance to the Jewish people who assisted them in accomplishing what they were meant to accomplish. But the rest of them, they go into the oblivion. The question is why? As we said, at the end of time, there's no place for evil. The reason why a person has to die and decompose is because we all have that evil of the tree of knowledge. Resurrection is at a time that's eternity. That's a relation with God. God has no relation with evil. God has no relation with the nations of the world. That's why it says, only a Jew has a share in the world to come. A non-Jew doesn't have a share unless he merits it by somehow hooking into the Jewish people. At the end of time, nations will not exist because who are they? They represent evil. They are the vacuum. But why did they have any ability to be the vacuum? Because the Jewish people did not fill in the vacuum. We have the ability to fill in that vacuum. I'll give you an example. There's a law, very interesting law, that if a person digs a hole, a pit in public domain, you created a menace. Somebody falls into that pit that you had dug. You're held liable for all damages. Anybody who's hurt, person's asset is destroyed because of that pit that you created. You have full liability. And you have to fully reimburse that person for any financial loss because you're the cause of that damage. You created the pit. So what about if the person created the pit, put a cover over the pit? So although the pit exists below that cover, and a third party takes away that cover, and somebody falls into the pit, that person initially who dug the pit, is he held accountable? The answer is no. Because he actually covered that pit. That pit no longer has relevance to society, so that menace is no longer there. Now, the one who uncovered the pit, he's the equivalent of digging that pit. Because why is that pit now in place to be the menace again? Because that second party uncovered the pit. The Talmud says, and it's based on the verse in the Torah, the one who covers the pit, he's the equivalent of he dug the pit. He dug the pit. But I didn't dig the pit. Because you uncovered it, therefore the pit exists. The nations of the world are the pit. We have the ability to fill in the pit. They're there. But we're able to hold them at bay, at such a degree, they have no relevance to existence. Only God's glory permeates all existence through what we generate, which is good. But the moment you start generating that goodness, they are there. And the vacuum grows. And when the vacuum grows, what is there? There's evil. And that evil affects us very negatively, to the point it could actually destroy us. You know, inhale enough toxic fumes, you die eventually. It's been 2,000 years we're inhaling a lot of this stuff. We live in an environment, a society, which represents nothing that we're all about, what we're supposed to be about. Although in physical sense, we don't realize it or understand what it's doing. But in what's happening today, you live in a conservative society where there are ethics and the morals, there's a balance, their values. You don't feel it as much. But what about all of a sudden the world takes on a whole different persona? It's reaching a level of progressiveness where male and female don't exist any longer. It's a crime to identify, put a label on a person. And that's changing reality, which is not to be believed. What's going on? What is all this? This is an indication of the vacuum. The vacuum has grown to so much, a person, very often, he can become delirious. People get a certain disease, they become delirious. And they begin seeing things which are not reality. Person hyperventilates, whatever it is. The world has been so deprived from Kedusha. They see reality as not reality. It's not real, but they see it. Because that's the way you live within a vacuum. When you have oxygen deprived from your brain, the brain doesn't function as it's supposed to be. It's oxygen deprivation. What happens to the brain? The brain doesn't work, doesn't operate, doesn't function. You can't process. There's lack of oxygen, there's lack of blood circulation. The blood is not being oxygenated. It's not. That's what we're experiencing today. How could a person say this is that if it's not that? Because these people, the world is so deprived spiritually. In the vacuum, that's the way you see it. Person goes into, you go to a, whatever it was called, this house where you have mirrors, you look in, everything is the store. Either you look like you're as thin as a rail, or you're as wide as a house. One mirror is more of a distortion of the other. There's an expression, smoke and mirrors. The whole world is smoke and mirrors. That's the reality. Well, why? Because when you can't see through the smoke, you see other things which are not reality. It takes on a whole different form. But what's generating that? What's generating that is the vacuum. Because if you had the oxygen, you had the good, you'd see things as you're supposed to see them. It's interesting. I personally have a problem with dry eye, so I have to take these artificial tears. If I don't put in these artificial tears in my eyes get irritated, my eyes get blurry, my vision gets blurred. I have to put it in. I didn't realize it until recently. I put it in, it's resolved almost instantaneously. Why? Because the eye has to be lubricated, and if the eye is not lubricated, and it gets dry, and it gets irritated, whatever it is, you can't see clearly. But the eye has the ability to see. Yeah, if the condition is right, this eye sees clearly. But once it doesn't have its lubrication, sometimes the car has to be greased, has to be oiled. It doesn't operate. Otherwise, it starts wearing down. There's metal. The metal gets worn down. You have to lubricate it. Otherwise, it doesn't go smoothly. And the wear and tear advances to a point where eventually it's what you call metal fatigue. And eventually it just breaks, disintegrates. It's interesting. So it's not the nations generate evil. They are evil. They are evil. As I said, they represent, when they rejected the Torah at Sinai, they already chose which side of the equation they stand on. We stand on the left. We don't stand on the right. When the Jews said Nasa v'nishma, if they wouldn't have said it, if the world is all on the left, God says, this is not my world. I have no relevance to this world. But when the Jews said Nasa v'nishma, and they said, we're with you, now the world takes on value. The Jew now has the ability to generate the goodness that the world was created for that purpose, which is called spiritual perfection. That man should have relevance to God. Nations have no relevance to God. It's very interesting. We have Sukkot is an 8-day holiday. You have 7 days Sukkot. We sit in the sukkah. We take the 4 species. On the 8th day, it's called Shmini Atzeres. It's an adjunct to Sukkot. We have no sukkah. We don't have the 4 species, but we observe it as a holiday. The 8th day, as a regular holiday. You're permitted to cook, to carry, but certain creative activities you're not permitted to do on the 8th day. Now, during the Sukkot period, the time of the temple, the Beis Hamikdash, they would bring every day so many bulls, which were communal offerings. Over the period of 7 days, they brought 70 oxen, bulls. On the 8th day, they brought 1. So over the whole holiday, the Yom Tif, they would bring 71 bulls, oxen. Who do these oxen correspond to? So the Talmud tells us that the oxen over the 7-day period, which is 70 bulls, correspond to the 70 nations of the world. All the sustenance, all the bracha, all the blessing they have, that they could exist as they exist, is only due to the oxen that are brought on their behalf in the temple. On their behalf. On the 8th day, the 71st first ox, 7 number 7, that's for the Jewish people. That represents the Jewish people. So there's a question, which is very simple. And the Talmud tells us, if the nations of the world would realize the value of the temple, that all the bracha, all the blessing and sustenance they receive is due to those funeral offerings that are brought on their behalf, they would encircle the temple with legions of soldiers to protect it, because their whole blessing and their whole success is based on that location. So not only did they not protect it, they destroyed it. So they victimize themselves. They hurt themselves by destroying it. But it doesn't make that, it seems to be difficult. The nations of the world are what? They're on the left side of the equation. We're on the right. So God says, bring oxen on their behalf, and all the blessing they receive is due to those oxen. What are we? We're supplying the enemy with the ammunition. Then now they can pull the trigger. What are we doing? Just simple understanding. What I'm telling you, Thomas says this explicitly. And that's the significance, the value of the 70 oxen. God created the world with a balance. They are what they are. But you realize, as we say, for us, in Kemach Torah, we live in the physical world. If there's no bread, there's no Torah. We have to be provided with our physical amenities, the basic amenities we need. And sometimes need more than that. The nations of the world can only function as what they are, only if they're maintained. But if evil is evil, and even you can be a representation of that, but you still have to be funded. Who funds the material for that evil? Who allows that vacuum to exist? God allows to exist. But who contributes to it? We contribute. We contribute. If we don't behave as we're supposed to behave, they're empowered. We're part of the empowerment because we're the cause of that empowerment. Because we could fill in that vacuum. But if we don't fill in the vacuum, we empower them. Because now that they function, Hitler, Yamach Shmov Zichro, if he wouldn't have had the material to produce the weaponry he did, there's not even a consideration. He would have actually been able to go against the United States or against all the other world powers. But he had the materials. And he created something which was almost undefeatable. He couldn't defeat it. But who contributed to all that? This is the personification of this is Amalek. Hitler was Amalek, which God says, my throne is not complete unless they're obliterated from the face of the world. When is that going to happen? We just read it, Bullock. At the end of time, there will not be a trace of Amalek. Amalek has no relevance to assist or to have any relevance to the Jewish people. So they go into the oblivion without a question. They don't have a chance. They openly tried to undermine the Jewish people continuously. And throughout history, this was. The Edomite exile is over 2,000 years. Longest exile. You combine all the exiles, it doesn't come to what the Edomite exile is. Why? Who is Edom? Edom is the ultimate counterbalance to Yaakov. Edom is Esav. Hakol kol Yaakov. Haydaim de Esav. When the voice is the voice of Jacob, the study of Torah and tefillah, prayer, is in place, Esav is incapacitated. The evil cannot rear its head. But the moment the voice is not there, and we're not generating all that positive through the study of Torah, through prayer and supplication, recognizing which is the hand that feeds us, rather than biting the hand that feeds us, then Esau rears his head, and that's the Edomites. He's still rearing his head. We can't somehow be extricated from this exile. The third temple is not here, but why? What's the reason? Because the call is not called Yaakov. The voice is not strong enough. We're not generating enough to clear all this impurity out of the world. The vacuum is very in force. There's not enough oxygen in the room. If there be enough good, there is no Edom. When the call is called Yaakov, it's like, somebody speaks, he says, you can't get a word edgewise. If the call is called Yaakov, you don't hear the craziness of the world. The world is reverberating with only sounds of holiness. Torah, prayer. The Chofetz Chaim writes at his time, towards the end of his life, after communism, after the Russian Revolution, he said, going back when he was a young man throughout Europe, Poland, Russia, Lithuania, the study halls were filled with Jews studying early in the morning, late at night. During the day they worked, but other people studied. Everything was booming and teeming. Towards after midlife of the Chofetz Chaim, he says, this is already like 1875. Shuls that were filled at one time were closed. Wasn't any longer. Things were not thriving. And he writes, that's why when the communists took over in time of Lenin and Trotsky, they made bonfires throughout Russia, and they took thousands of Sifrei Torah and they just tossed them into the fire. And they burnt them. You hear this? Jewish books, we're not talking about just printed books, Sifrei Torah, Torah scrolls. They burnt them by the thousands. He says, why? You know what kind of disgrace? If a Jew sees a Sefer Torah burning, you're supposed to rent your clothing. Your clothing. That's what kind of tragedy it is. And here they were just tossing thousands of the Sifrei Torah into fires. And the shuls and the study halls were totally closed. Nobody was interested. He says, because when it was available, they turned their back on it. And because the Jews who had the ability to give it value did not, and they disgraced it, God says, you know something? Now you can see exactly the consequence of your behavior. Evil, the vacuum is going to become so intense, there's not going to be a place for a Sefer Torah. Not even to be in an ark. They'll take it and they'll burn it. They're going to incinerate it. Then there shouldn't be a vestige of what that is because you didn't value it. You could have taken that and magnified it. And because you did not, and you left it and you disgraced it by not addressing it, therefore the vacuum becomes so intense, it'll consume everything. And what happens when there's a vacuum? There's no oxygen. You suffocate. Can't breathe. Until after the Stalin era, it went from bad to worse. If you were caught with a Hebrew book, you're caught with a picture of an ancestor who had a beard, you know what happened to you? They sent you to Siberia. Stalin would not tolerate anything that had any semblance of religion. He would eradicate immediately in the most vicious way. He was willing to have the Jews exist, but if you in any way identified with your religion, you didn't exist any longer. Would not tolerate it. The Nazis, Yimach Shema V'Zichron, even if you were an assimilated Jew, you were 50% Jew, even though halachically you weren't Jewish, but there was enough in your genealogy you were Jewish, he would actually send you to a concentration camp. He would eradicate you. It was even more intense, that vacuum. Because that's Amalek. Because the Germans were Amalek. It's more than just a vacuum of evil. They are the evil. They perpetrated the evil. So Bilam, the nation, the prophet of the nations, his whole objective and value and purpose was to snuff out any vestige that this vacuum, he didn't say this vacuum, he saw it as that's the purpose of existence. There should be no God in this existence. You know, it's interesting. He's a prophet, the equivalent of Moshe Rabbeinu, and he doesn't want God to exist in this existence. That's number one difficulty. Secondly, Bilam, if he was such a level of prophet and he had such level of clarity, it's clear from this last week's reading, his donkey, you know, he committed bestiality with his donkey. Firstly, why would God even want to be associated with such a despicable character? But if you have that level of clarity who God is, I mean, how do you behave this way? People only behave because they believe whatever they believe. But if you have that understanding of God, and God's wrath could destroy this world, that's why he wanted to curse us at the moment of God's wrath. How do you make it this way? Famous question. So there's a beautiful word from Chaim Volozhiner, and with this we can understand it. There's an expression, Larry used to belong to the Eagle Scouts when he was a kid. When his parents sent him off for 10 years to the country, he used to have Boy Scout camp. There were Eagle Scouts. There's an expression, eagle-eyed. There's no bird in the world that's able to see the distance of an eagle. Why? I'm quoting Rav Chaim Volozhiner. No bird could fly as high as an eagle. When an eagle soars, the light of the sun deflects off the topography of the ground, of the earth, and the different shapes. It's not flat. The eye of the eagle, as it soars and comes down, its eyes are able to take that light the way it refracts off the earth, and as it's able to see hundreds of miles, an eagle, as it flies. So nobody sees us like an eagle. But what does an eagle do? It uses light to illuminate the world. That's what it has such an eye, because that's the species of the eagle. A bat cannot see. But yet, even though the bat has no idea what light is, can't see. But the moment the sun comes up, or there's any degree of light, what does the bat do? It goes to recesses of a cave where that light doesn't exist. But does the bat know what light is? It does know what light is. But as a sense, whatever it is, it escapes from it. It goes to the nth degree, to go to the deepest recesses of the cave where the light doesn't have any relevance. No species has a sensitivity like the bat to what light is, although the bat doesn't know what light is. Bilam had a sensitivity to God's presence, but did he know what God was? Bilam had no idea what God was. He knew exactly when God is enraged. What is this? But he knows it's a force. Holiness, he cannot tolerate. Like the bat cannot tolerate light. Bilam cannot tolerate light. The light is called the Kedusha of the Jewish people. The holiness, he can't tolerate it. Does he know what it is? He doesn't know what it is. But it's like an anti-Semite. He doesn't even know what a Jew is. But he wishes there'd be no Jews in existence. There's something in the spiritual makeup, it's like you have an allergic reaction. You don't even know why, but it's something you don't want to be, because the moment you come within the proximity of something, your skin begins crawling. You start having a breakout. You have an allergic reaction, you can't breathe. That's the bat. So Bilam Moshe saw God. He understood God. If you understand God, you can't behave any other way than Moshe Rabbeinu behaved. If you had that level of clarity. Nobody had the acute sense of light the way Bilam did. As a result of that, he knew exactly when it was the moment to curse the Jews. God did not allow himself to become angry during those days that he wanted to curse us. So Bilam should not be able to curse us. So why did Bilam want to snuff out that there shouldn't be a vestige of Jewish people in this world? Because again, it's like the bat to the light. That's what Bilam was to the Jewish people. He had epitomized evil. And because he epitomized evil, he could not tolerate what the Jew was. He failed in Egypt. That's why he was the one who gave the final solution to destroy the Jewish people through being totally subsumed by the evil of Egypt. He failed. Not only did one Jew leave Egypt, millions of people left Egypt. He was disgraced before the eyes of the world. Now he's going to succeed. He will curse us. God didn't let him curse us. So finally came up with another way. He says, the God of the Jews cannot tolerate licentiousness. They misbehave in this area, he'll wipe them out. And it nearly happened. 24,000 Jews died in the plague when they engaged with the Moabite women, with the Balpor, with that idolatry. Only because of Pinchas's intervention, his zealotry, that's why it didn't happen. But otherwise, it would have happened. And eventually, Bilam was killed. So his level of representation came to an end. That we have to deal with new issues. The evil of the 7 nations of Canaan. They have another representation of evil. They have to be destroyed. But till the end of time, what do we have to contend with? Amalek. God says, until Amalek is removed from existence, my throne is not complete. The nations of the world, as I said, they're evil. It's a different type. There we contribute to that. We could bring the oxygen to the room. There's no vacuum. Amalek, it's not because there's no oxygen. We can incapacitate him. But he is self-generating of that evil, what he is. He advances because he represents the worst part of what Esav was. That's Esav son of Yaakov. Esav cannot tolerate Yaakov's existence for that reason. Here.